Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, once more, thank you for coming on today's podcast.
I am extremely excited to be here, and I'm also incredibly excited to speak to today's guest, who I've had the pleasure of following for some time now. She's a former academic who's currently Aerial Magazine sub-editor, the host of the podcast 2 for Tea, and part of the team over there at Letter.wiki. This incredible lady is also a fellow science fiction enthusiast and shares the enjoyment of many common science fiction shows with us, with Star Wars being a possible exception.
Oh,
Please welcome
Star Wars.
Please welcome Dr. Iona Italia. Iona, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to speak to you personally. I recommend people follow you on Twitter all the time and to give your podcast 2 for Tea a listen.
Thank you so much.
How have you been during this pandemic? How have you been holding up?
Actually, I have to say that I have been guiltily enjoying the lockdown. In fact, one of my housemates made the somewhat hyperbolic and ironic remark, "I love this pandemic," the other day. Don't take that too seriously, please, before everyone starts attacking me. But I do, at the beginning, when I arrived back in London, so I was planning to move back to London at the end of April, and I left in mid-March at the very last moment. I was sitting on my bed listening to Trump on the news announcing some travel ban, and I suddenly realized they're going to start canceling flights, and I'm not going to be able to get back unless I go now.
Wow.
So I booked a flight for the very next day. And I was only permitted hand luggage, so I had to get rid of quite a lot of my stuff. I had to leave a lot of stuff behind, and I had to just write off the cost of my original flight, which has never been refunded. I cannot get Norwegian Air to talk to me at all. And I'd also paid rent there. So it cost, I guess I wrote off in the end several $1,000s worth of costs to do that. But I managed to arrive here in London, and the very day that I arrived, I heard that there would be no further international flights from Ezeiza in Buenos Aires. So if I had not gone then, I would still be in Buenos Aires right now. And I live with four housemates in a vicarage because an old friend of mine is a vicar, and he is married to one of my oldest friends. And we live with his brother and another old mutual friend of ours. So I live in a very sort of quasi-family style situation here. And it's a very beautiful house, thanks to the Church of England. And it's in a really lovely spot, actually. I live directly opposite. For anonymity reasons, I think that I will not mention exactly where it is, but I live opposite a very large and beautiful a green space, and I mean directly opposite, like the entrance is across the road. And so it's I have retreated into this solipsistic little world at home where I would quite like to have a boyfriend. If you have any takers, then please take a number, join the queue. But apart from that, I feel almost as though I don't really need anything else. So my my housemates have been furloughed from work and they have been gardening and cooking ferociously and competitively all day long. And we have been eating meals together, taking it turns to cook and wash up and watching films together and playing bridge and sitting in the garden a lot. And I've been going for long walks in the parkland. And I work online anyway, so it hasn't affected my work at all. So I think when I first arrived, the first couple of weeks, I was compulsively reading the news, and I was very worried about just what was going on in the general world. And I had this horrible sense that we were just in for a huge amount of suffering. Not me personally, actually, but just humanity in general. And I was really anxious and worried, and I was not having a lot of nightmares, not sleeping. And I had no really direct and immediate concerns for myself. So I live in a very comfortable situation. And so far, the pandemic has not affected me financially, and I should touch. I can't see if I don't know if there's any wood here, but this is a cutting from a tree, so I
I'll
will
knock on wood for you.
touch this. It's like a miniature tree, and I'm also not at all afraid of catching COVID-19. In fact, I'm rather a COVID-19 dove. But maybe we'll get into that if you want to hear my more controversial and crazy views. But I'm not at all concerned about catching it personally, but I am worried about being a vector. I am very careful. And basically, I think that after a few weeks, my sense of how disastrous and terrible it was going to be, I don't know if I completely lost that sense, but I think I got compassion fatigue and I just stopped worrying about it. And I have since then been really enjoying this kind of domestic retreat. It's like a sort of staycation. I enjoy the fact of not having any FOMO, not feeling like I ought to. I mean, there are many things that I, in theory, want to do. And the reason I feel I ought to do them is because I want to have those things in my life, like going out to the theater, going out dancing in particular, seeing my friends, traveling. But it's also a great relief to just not be able to do any of those things.
I think you and I both share a love of dancing as well as science fiction. And, I've been dealing with the lockdown, spending some time trying to learn how to cook better. And, we've been trying to use the time to pass constructively with the full knowledge that we all hope everything gets better eventually and things can hopefully return to some semblance of normal. Yeah, I'd like to get into some of the topics that I wanted to run past you today.
Sure.
You and I chatted a little bit offline, and one of the things I definitely wanted to discuss with you is the state of our media. You're heavily involved with Aereo magazine, and
Yes.
it's one of right now what I believe is two main sources of news that tries to maintain some semblance of objectivity between the, just to put it bluntly, insane narratives between the left and the right, with both sides spewing their own sense of nonsensical gibberish. The other source of news being Quillette, which is run by Claire Lehman. Now, I especially value both of these sources now because it allows nuance to be discussed in a public square, which is not common. And what we see coming out of Fox and Breitbart and CNN, the New York Times, has material catering to their right and left-wing bases, which is really encouraging this polarization we're seeing. We've grown so incredibly tribal that anything that sounds like a scintilla that the narrative the other side may be pushing gets dismissed or pushed aside. And I'm curious as to what the reception has been like to Aereo. James Lindsley, when we spoke to him, I think he believes that there's a silent majority out there who who are starved for a very very nuanced take in the middle. But with the recent circumstances regarding George Floyd's murder, I don't know if I believe this is the truth anymore. I'm wondering if this nuanced middle is actually a minority, and I'm strongly inclined to believe that it is. So, what is your feeling on this? What is the reception of Aereo been like?
That's a good question. I think that I feel as though we've had a generally very good reception. Um, it's hard to tell because I think that people who are generally extremely aggrieved will tend to be more noticeable and will tend to stick in my mind more. And we do have a few stalkers and things. I mean, I really think they're almost like stalkers, people who just make dozens of accounts on Twitter in order to tweet at us how much they hate the magazine, and also people who write emails to us. Most of them have been blocked. And a few people who seem a little bit kind of worrying, who we've just sort of told some relevant experts about them, and now we just disregard. So we do have a few detractors, ranging from people who just don't like the content to we had a couple of kind of death threats. I mean, not in any way credible, but just people who are very, 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 very angry. One most recently an Islamist. We have a kind of Islamist stalker who is very upset that we publish work by ex-Muslims. Oh, wow. And he feels the magazine is blasphemous. Usually our policy is to ignore such people, and just keep the evidence just in case, but don't reply, or don't publicly allude to them, or I guess I'm alluding to them right now, but don't give them too much oxygen. But I think that largely there's been a pretty positive response. I do feel that we have we've had somewhat more we've had more kind of non-social justice leftist takes than anything else in Aereo. That's probably been about 2/3 of our material statistically. And a lot of those are from academics. And I would say that is because there is a sense of political homelessness among people who are believe themselves to be on the left, because they share most of the policy. They agree with most of the policies of leftist parties, and they vote for mainstream leftist parties like the Democrats, and here in the UK, the Labour Party. And they hold economically left-wing views, and are also, they're not socially conservative, but they really don't agree with left-wing identity politics. Well, any kind of identity politics. But they don't agree with left-wing identity politics and a lot of social justice and critical theory ideology. And we do also have a bunch of more thoughtful conservatives who write for us, and a few libertarians, and a few people who are really on the hard left. I think Ralph Leonard is probably the most leftist of those. He's a Marxist. So what we lack is people from the social justice left, and I have recently been trying to build more bridges with them. And we've had a few people, a couple of them have written articles recently for the magazine, including articles that are directly taking issue with Helen's own work. And I'm actually very flattered and pleased by that development, because it suggests that they rightly think that we will publish well-written, calm and nuanced arguments that we disagree with within the magazine. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to the trouble of making a submission, presumably. So I would say that that has been the kind of balance, and the people who have enjoyed Ario the most and responded the most favorably are kind of non-social justice leftists.
I see.
I think this is these independent news websites such as Ario and Quillette, they're very much needed. They're very important, especially in times like these when, as Bruce said, nuance is almost nowhere to be found. And what concerns me, though, is that there aren't enough of these, and it's making the political landscape look either blue or red. You know, as popular as Joe Rogan is, just one Joe Rogan is not enough in this conversation. There needs to be more in order for a society to function properly. And, you know, this level of political divide just simply can't continue. And we know from the work of people like evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller that neurodiversity is one of the most important aspects in these types of conversations. But the further we go forward in time, the less appreciated neurodiversity is. And this is no more apparent than the time it is right now, where you're either on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement or you're complicit in the structural systemic racism. So do you think that this problem is only going to get worse? Or is there a silver lining somewhere that I'm just not seeing?
You know, I'm not certain. I think that at a kind of macro level, I am concerned about what I think of as a kind of American cultural imperialism. So my feeling about the Black Lives Matter is that I'm quite strongly supportive of the protests in the US. Although that is partly because I am somewhat of a COVID dove, and I take the view that I think there's little evidence to suggest that there's a lot of strong transmission when people are outdoors. So I'm a bit less concerned that it's going to lead to a major spike in reinfections. And I think that it is the kind of momentum that people have gathered is a momentum that could be used for good. Mm-hmm. We've grabbed hold of this thread now. Suddenly a whole kind of a whole sweater of police brutality and injustice is unraveling. And I do think that although I'm convinced by the stats that Glenn Lowry and others have provided that Black people are no more likely to be killed by police than other people of other races, I think that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that they do have a very different experience of policing, that the police are more likely to be rude, abusive, violent in non-lethal ways, and that this situation is kind of untenable, and it is it's unjust, and it's also potentially disastrous for society because it erodes community trust in the police. And I'd like to see very major reform for the US police. Mm-hmm. However, our police are not armed. Most of them are not even in riot gear, and they're not using, we're not using rubber. So far, there's been no rubber bullets, no tear gas. We've had huge protests, and I think that we seem to have just imported all of the slogans and ideas from the US wholesale. And I don't think, I think that there are racial issues and problems and tensions in UK society, but I don't think anti-Black racism is the main factor in that. I think the main factor in Europe is our Muslim communities and the various issues around, both on the one hand, a kind of resurgence of conservative Islamic piety, which can be very misogynistic and homophobic, and on the other hand, a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry. So I feel as though our issues are different issues, and our police are different police, and I don't want to suggest the police are blameless, but I think that the scale of the problem is completely different in the States by orders of magnitude. So I am kind of concerned with this.
Yeah, I think everything that you said, Roland Fryer, the economist at Harvard, did some research on this topic and really resembled everything that you said, where when it comes to black people being disproportionately killed by police, there's very little evidence to suggest that. But when it comes to more violent encounters with the police, whether that be pepper spraying or raising your voice more prominently, there is evidence to show that black people and minorities in particular do get this sort of attitude towards them at a much higher rate than anybody else. So I think you could be right that there needs to be change in that sort of, in that aspect. But in the United States, it is crazy. And part of your points, I think part of the problem is that the United States just has a strangely different culture than European countries, especially when it comes to guns, when it comes to the law enforcement viewings. So it's such a strange time that we're living in right now. And what concerns me is that there's just simply not enough nuance to go around on this topic when you have, even though they might be a minority, they're a very loud minority wanting to not just defund the police, but abolish the police altogether. And these are narratives that are just being taken in stride, and they have so much institutional power that they're being parroted by some of the biggest YouTube people out there with like hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So it is strange, it's crazy, and I wonder if we're ever going to end up going the European route, so for instance, unarmed police officers, where it's just not necessary to arm them anymore. But who knows?
That would be nice.
Yeah.
I think that, so one of my friends on Facebook so he explained the abolish the police slogan to me as he takes it. When people say defund the police or abolish the police, what they mean is do a very radical reform. Mm-hmm. So it's just one of the problems. So I think one of the things about this polarization is the sloganeering, that people, in order to do protests, you need a short, snappy thing that you can say. You can't protest, you can't chant a paragraph. But at the same time, because of these short, snappy things, they sound very extreme, and B, they lead to a lot of misunderstanding, because often there's an understood context for some which may differ from person to person. And there can be kind of Mott and Bailey things going on. So people who actually want to do the extreme thing, and when you question them, they retreat to a much more reasonable sounding position. My friend, however, because I know him personally, I know that he is he's not attempting to create a bait and switch of that kind. That he is saying defund the police, and that for him is shorthand for we need to do very radical reforms of the police.
Yeah, defund the police and then focus those, what money would have originally gone to the police force, and just trying to fix the socioeconomic factors that are the root cause of these sort of things.
Right, not all of it though. It's kind of like defund the present police and make whatever you are setting up in its stead prove to you that they are worth your taxpayers' money, taxpayer dollars. So the financial incentives at the moment are poorly aligned. So related to this are also some proposals to sue the police in civil courts, which I think at the moment is not possible or not completely possible. There are some serious restrictions on that. When there are cases of unjustified violence or shootings, if rather than just trying the individual police officer, you can sue that police precinct or station or whatever in civil court and make it hit them in their wallets, then that incentivizes them to regulate better. So this is the kind of thing that he is advocating, and he's using the hashtag defund the police. So when I heard, for example, the protesters yesterday asking the Minnesota mayor whether he would defund the police or not, and I thought he was very brave because he was standing on his own, and he's a very slight little guy. Right. He looks like a 15-year-old boy. I was everyone's response was, "That is the mayor," but of course, to me, everyone in authority looks so young. But thank goodness the US still have geriatric presidents, so some authority figure is still older than me, because I always feel that is the priest, that's the headmaster, that's the prime minister or whatever. They're so young. Anyway, he was standing there on his own, surrounded by this mob who were shouting, asking him to say that he would commit to defunding the police, and he said no. And I think that was it was very courageous of him to say what he thought, despite the fact that he was on his own, surrounded by a very angry crowd, and things could have turned violent. They didn't, but things possibly could have turned violent. But also, he clearly understood defund the police to mean abolish the police. So I think that people mean different things when they say these hashtags, and that is part of the problem, that we get caught up in semantic games.
Yeah, this reminds me of the situation when the hashtag Kill All Men became so popular, and people like Ezra Klein had to come out and say, obviously it's not literally meaning kill all men, but rather, wouldn't it be nice if life for women sucked less? And so I think this is just a huge, this plays into the huge PR problem.
Well, I think that is slightly different. So I feel that the defund thing is a little bit more ambivalent, the word itself and the hashtag itself. Whereas I feel as though these performative extremist statements like kill all men, or the things with Sarah Jong when she was saying white people are like dogs pissing on fire hydrants or whatever it is. She wrote this tweet saying, "I absolutely adore seeing old white men really suffer." Those kinds of performative statements where people say the thing and then when you push them on it, they say, "Oh, I didn't mean that at all." That really annoys me. I find that it just muddies the waters. Well, it just puts blood in the water. It just kind of gets people, it's designed to provoke people and make them angry. And I think it's okay to provoke people and make them angry if it's your point of view that makes them angry and it's your sincerely held point of view. But if you are just deliberately choosing inflammatory language in order to make people angry, it feels very cheap to me. And I hate that kind of game.
Iona, are you familiar with Tom Nichols by any chance?
No, that rings a bell, but
he was on Sam Harris's podcast, and Vince and I recently had the opportunity to attend an online lecture by him. He wrote a book called The Death of Expertise.
Yes.
Yeah. And he describes that there's almost a complete breakdown of institutional trust with, there are certain institutions on both the left and the right that either side ascribes to, and there seems to be a degradation of trust in those respective institutions. I think part of that can be attributed to our news networks. Like, we have mainstream media like Fox and CNN. Right now, I believe they've long underestimated the power of long-form conversations and what they bring to the table. So I thought that was a really interesting jab that CNN in particular took at Joe Rogan a few months ago when they accused him of being transphobic. Now, he invites all sorts of people to share their views in depth on the show, whether they're liberal or conservative, and he allows the listeners to join him on the journey that he's taken them on. And I view this personally as a plus because it allows complexity to be explored, but I'm now of the view that this complexity can only really be delved into if the host is engaging, challenging the speaker to um, asking him or her piercing questions to really flesh out nuance and whatnot. We see
Mm,
that
mm.
now with Joe Rogan, but not so much with Dave Rubin anymore. I was
Yes, I
I
agree.
was
Mm.
I was a fan of his, but I gradually lost interest, and there came a point now where I've lost almost all respect for him, for his work, once his actions just became hypocritical. Now, whether or not we eventually find our way out of the mess between regressive left and populist right politics, long form conversations seem to be here to stay. And I think this is how we more or less can consume our news from now on. But right now, there's a danger of amplifying someone's voice that shouldn't be amplified. News networks
Mm,
were once
mm.
trusted as the gatekeepers of information. That we used to trust them to curate information before presentation. And I'm hoping long form can deal with polarization, but it also strikes me that it can make things worse depending on the agenda and, quite frankly, the intelligence of the interviewer. With the most flagrant examples being Dave Rubin and Candace Owens.
Mm. Oh
I
gosh, yes.
Yeah, and
I think she's one of the most toxic people in public life at the moment, Candace.
Mhm.
because she mixes truth with toxic narrative and lies. I used to think that letting a guest go on without interruption to speak their mind was a good thing, and I still, to an extent, do. But without questioning someone, we don't challenge bad ideas or explore depth that requires. Let me back up a bit. For someone to actually explore that depth, that requires a depth and breadth of knowledge of the subject at hand. With these new media formats, what responsibility do these hosts have with regards to letting someone have their say and in terms of an intellectual challenge presented to them? Like for instance, right
Mm.
now, Vince and I are interviewing you, and I say with absolute confidence that the two of us are nowhere near your intellectual league. So, what kind of responsibility do we
Right.
as
I'm
hosts?
not sure that's true. Now I feel a lot of pressure.
But as this format becomes more popular, what kind of responsibility would these new hosts have in order to allow someone to have their say, but also push back in a fashion that allows um, nuance and fine thought to come right out? Because as we see with someone like Dave Rubin, that doesn't always happen, and some really toxic views can be amplified without um, an appropriate good faith challenge is presented.
Mm. Well, so I followed Ruben's podcast until mid 2018. I think I gave up on his podcast when he was interviewing Gad Saad, and I gave up kind of mid-interview. I was like, not more of this. um, and since then, I've only listened to occasionally individual things because I have seen on the timelines of people I follow and respect that they were on Ruben, and then I've listened to them on Ruben um, because I'm interested in hearing their views, and it doesn't matter to me so much which platform they're on. But since I've been doing my own platform, I've had my own podcast, I've had a lot more, not respect, I wouldn't exactly say that, but I have more human empathy with Ruben. And I will publicly state here that I would go on his podcast in a heartbeat because I think that if you feel that you have something important to say, you should use every platform that you can to put your message out. I think it's perfectly okay to go on Fox News. It's probably even okay to go on InfoWars. I think it's definitely fine to go on the Rubin Report. InfoWars maybe might be a step too far, but I mean, I don't think you should write for the Daily Stormer, but except for the very most extreme things, I think you should. If a platform gives you a large audience and you feel that what you have to say deserves to reach a large audience, and if you don't feel that, you probably shouldn't be saying it. Um, then I think that you should use those platforms. So I don't have feel any. Um, I I don't have a kind of I don't have critiques for people for having been on Rubin. And I would love to go on Ruben. And I'm also sure that he's quite charming in person. But I think one thing I've realized doing the podcast is it's very hard to push back on to someone you agree with, you basically agree with. You can't. You get kind of. There clearly are places where pushback could happen, but you just don't see them because you agree. And when you are told something you agree with, it's very flattering. It makes you feel, ooh, this clever person said this. I must be clever as well because I already thought that way. I already, or maybe you hadn't even thought it before, but it suddenly this thought also occupies your mind and you're kind of sharing in their cleverness. And it makes it very difficult, I feel, to push back. There's also, I think, the larger the platform gets, you also have a kind of audience capture phenomenon. I'm going to take my sweater off. It's been kind of unusually cold today, but I'm getting a little warm. One moment.
No worries.
No problem.
There's a kind of an audience capture also, that you know there are certain things your audience is hoping to hear from you, and it's so gratifying to give the audience what they want, and it need not even be conscious. It's more like the audience kind of trains you. You have this Pavlovian response. You get your hearts on Twitter, or your likes or your subscriptions, your little dopamine hits, and it makes you want to give them more of the same. So I think that both of those trends are very hard to buck. And I have pushed back quite a lot on some interviewees, but on others, I really feel I've just kind of said yes to everything that they have said throughout the course of the interview because I just don't disagree. And it has this chummy feel, and I'm not really sure how to avoid that. And I also think that I'm not fundamentally terribly good at, I was going to say debating, but I think that I am very good at debating, formal debating, where you pick the side out of a hat. You're told the debate is on abortion, rummage around in the hat and see if you have to do the pro side or the con side. That is very easy because it's like a performance. There's nothing hanging upon it. Everybody knows this. These may or may not be your own opinions. You're performing in the debating chamber. But when I'm trying to defend my own opinions, I can become very emotional, and then I find it hard to speak in a calm and clear manner, and I don't make very strong points, and I get very frustrated. So I think that I would find it very difficult to have someone on the podcast with whom I had radical disagreements. So I have had some people on the podcast with whom I've had disagreements. I think the most conflict-ridden interview was with Aaron Rabinovitz, with whom I have a very complicated love-hate personal relationship also. And he is very much a social, he calls himself a social justice warrior. He considers that a compliment. He is very much on the social justice woke left. And he is an opponent of free speech. So I had an extremely conflict-ridden discussion with him, but I think that's the most pushback I've given a guest. And generally, I choose guests who I think that I already admire, and I don't give them huge pushback. And I try not to let anything completely go. I try to at least say, well, I don't agree with you on that, but let's not get into that right now. I try to at least register if there's a point of disagreement. But pushback is not easy, and I think not many people are gifted at this. Arguing is hard. And it's I think that what we tend to do with arguments is go in one of two directions. And this is something I was talking to Buster Benson about. He's written a book on this. And one direction is that um, we shout at each other from very extreme positions. That's kind of safe because I'm over here and you're over there.
Yeah.
So we don't kind of approach. I shout black and you shout white. Well, that's probably not the best choice of words. I shout Star Trek and you shout Star Wars. And that is just so abhorrent to me as a preference that, I'm not even going to try to steel man that view. It's just how anybody could like Star Wars is just ludicrous. So we're like at diametric opposite ends of the spectrum. And that is also, in a sense, it's kind of a way of conflict avoiding because we're not really getting to grips with the nitty-gritty. We're keeping kind of a distance. And then the other thing that we do is this kind of milquetoast sort of tame thing of we won't discuss the really important thing, the thing that is the real disagreement between us. We'll just agree to disagree. We'll talk about other topics. We'll change the subject. We won't mention religion and politics at the dinner table or whatever it is. So there are these two kind of forms of conflict in a sense, conflict avoidance. And in the first one in particular, in the second one, what we're afraid of is losing personal relationships and friendships. And as a result, in a sense, we're weakening personal relationships and friendships because we're hiding or siloing off some part of ourselves that is important to us from our friend because we're afraid if we get into that territory, our friendship will fracture. And that suggests that there's a vulnerability at the heart of the friendship. That's kind of unsatisfying. And the other form of conflict, although it might seem like that's kind of rushing into the conflict and can give you lots of adrenaline and stuff, I think that it's also avoidant because what we are shying away from is the possibility of being convinced by the other person and changing our minds. So we get stuck into this pattern of trying to change their mind with more or less efficacy, or just like virtue signaling and shouting for our tribe. But we're not open to trying to change our mind. We're like, no, I'm not going to watch the prequels again with you. I don't want to have my mind changed. I'm so certain I'm right that I sort of also don't want to examine it. I'd rather not look too closely, just in case. I don't know if that's making sense.
Yeah, strange examination of the Star Wars prequels, but I would agree with you. I would never ever want to watch those things again. It's awful. Mm-hmm. But if there's anybody we shouldn't platform, it's people who think the Star Wars prequels were good. Those are too dangerous. But
yeah, I mean, I do also live in fear that somebody who was a guest of my podcast, who I treated with great politeness and kindness, turns out to be a Nazi or something. Because I really don't. I vet my guests a little bit, so there are some people who I have some major agreements with, who I think are interesting, but I'm just not sure about that I want to be associated with them, and so I haven't invited them on. And there are some guests who are continually suggested to me, and I'm like, I don't know, I feel a little bit iffy. I feel a little bit iffy about platforming them.
yeah.
Because I think some of their other views are not very nice. I mean, I wouldn't blame any other podcaster for choosing to platform them, let me be plain, but I feel kind of like, Well, I don't want to confront them on these things. I'd rather talk about something else with them. But I also I kind of feel that unless you are very clearly willing to unless you have the courage to be confrontational and really address people's problematic views on your podcast, putting them on your podcast is kind of an endorsement. If you know they are a Star Wars fan and you have them on your podcast, you really need to address that and push back, or else it may seem like you're tacitly endorsing Star Wars. Yeah. So that's my feeling, and I think that the closest guest I've had to that was I had Eric Kaufman on my podcast to discuss White Shift, and I actually really liked that book. But I deliberately didn't kind of investigate Eric too much because I think he may have some more unsavory opinions. He may. This is completely a guess. So, Eric, if you're listening, I apologize if this is slander. But I deliberately sort of just this book is really interesting. I want to talk to him. I'm not going to look at anything else, just in case.
Yeah.
Because I heard some rumors, and I'm not going to go by rumors, but I'm not going to investigate. And I think we did have a very good talk, and I feel that I didn't on the podcast endorse anything that I am uncomfortable with. But I have only read that one book. And there are a few other people who I prefer not to name, but I find something they've done really interesting or valuable, but I'm a bit iffy on them in general. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't had them on.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I can be a David Pakman. I don't think I can have crazy or people with crazy or bad ideas on the podcast and just demolish them. I don't think I can do the Iona eviscerates Star Wars fan, leaves him bleeding and crying for mercy in a heap on the floor, and then eats his body.
I know for a fact that I'm a fan of Star Wars, and I would never want to debate you on that.
Very wise.
But that's an interesting topic of discussion where a lot of people would argue that you should always sort of have these people with really radical and deeply offensive views on your podcast, because all you need to do is just give them enough rope to hang themselves with. I don't think that's enough, though. In my opinion, I always say that if you're going to have someone who has very unsavory views, let's say you're going to have a Nazi onto the podcast, I think that's perfectly fine. But there's an intellectual responsibility on your behalf to know your mettle when it comes to this sort of topic so you can push back on them. It's not enough just to give them enough rope, because if they have a silver tongue, they can sound intelligent on. It doesn't matter how crazy or ridiculous the idea is. So long as they have the gift of the gab, they can convince a large number of people. So there's got to be some intellectual responsibility on behalf of the interviewer to know what he's talking about when it comes to this sort of topic. And the instance that always comes to mind is when Sargon of Akkad debated these Nazis, I think it was white supremacists. And because he just went in under the assumption that, well, white supremacy is, of course, inherently ridiculous, no one's going to actually take these guys seriously, everyone seemed to come away from that debate as if he basically just got his ass handed to him because he didn't really understand the opposition's viewpoint. And so what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there should be some sort of intellectual responsibility on behalf of the interviewer to know what he's getting himself into?
Yes. I mean, I would qualify how I'm using the word should there. I mean, I am a radical believer in free speech. I describe myself as a free speech extremist. So I think you should certainly be able to have anybody in your podcast you want and to behave in any way you want towards them. But yes, I think being able to, whether you're should be legally able to, and whether you should are, of course, two different, are very often in life two different things. There are lots of things I think should be perfectly legal, but I really don't think you should do, like watching Star Wars. But but I think that uh, yes, I think that if you're going to have people on with um, genuinely pernicious views, you have to be careful. So Pacman has the intellectual capacity and also the kind of sang-froid to do that. So he could have anybody on his podcast. Um, and another person with whom I actually have a lot of disagreements, Douglas Murray, talking of somebody who is extremely eloquent, but with whom I have many ideological disagreements. Though I don't consider Murray to be a kind of beyond the pale fascist or anything like that, but I feel like some of his views are not good. But Douglas, for example, has this policy of speaking to absolutely anybody, and I think he interviewed jihadists and things like that because he's just he knows that he can take on anybody, and I think that you have to have both the right kind of intellect and the right kind of personality, because there are a lot of people who could who, if they were faced with the views in writing, could debunk them. But when you're face to face with a person, they can be very intimidating, and you can get emotional about it. That can make you tongue-tied, or it can make you look out of control if you get upset, even if you are in the right, because there's this sort of presumption that the person who is calmer is the one who is correct, and we all have this this. I think it's something that's damaged the social justice left, and sometimes unduly, actually, that we all have this image of the blue-haired undergraduate student who is screaming and crying and things. And I think that the screaming and crying and having blue hair is unhelpful, but it's neither here nor there. So it's kind of important to discount that, because the person screaming and crying and looking ridiculous might nevertheless be the person in the right. And the person very calmly marshalling rational sounding arguments could be the person in the wrong. And also I think that this is there's an is-ought gap also. That's the Humean thing, that you can't, I don't think that you can rationally prove an ethical imperative. So you can't, if I just feel like torturing puppies, or then I shouldn't torture puppies. And if you see me torturing a puppy, you would be correct to be screaming and crying and things, you know. But I don't think that there's a rational argument you can make as to why I should not. You can say that I ought to care, but what if I say, well, I don't give a shit. I just really enjoy, as Sarah Jong said, I really enjoy seeing them suffer. What if I'm a complete sociopath? So I think that it's the reason why it's so difficult to have some of these arguments and why they get so emotive and out of control is that it isn't always about rationality. Sometimes it really is an appeal to the better angels of our nature, and maybe an appeal to enlightened self-interest. Very often enlightened self-interest can play a role. If you behave this way, other people will too, and then you won't enjoy that. But not always, and there is that gap. It's not always possible to prove your ethical point in a rational way, and hence there's a limit to logic, and logic can be on the side of the bad person with the bad views. Actually,
Iona, how much more time do you have? We've been going for about an hour. I want to be respectful of your time.
Well, I'm fine. So we can go on until we kind of fizzle out, or however much time is useful to you.
Okay, sounds good. So I guess we could probably then shift the conversation towards a different direction, one that has to do with sort of the state of social media right now. So a big topic of conversation that has been circulating recently is this whole idea of having fact-checking algorithms, that there must be some mechanism in place that is able to distinguish reliable news sources versus unreliable news sources. Do you think that this is an implementation that you support, or is there something Orwellian about websites such as Facebook telling you what is and isn't reliable, or is the campaign of misinformation a bigger problem?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. Um, that's a really difficult one. I think that I think that there should be some policing of fraud. So if you, Vincent, are pretending to be a dentist or something, and you're giving advice on tooth care, or you're saying, "Come over and let me get out my tools and give you a root canal," then that should not be allowed. So there should, I think that when people are making claims on the basis of credentials, I think that the credentials should be checked if they're making claims on that basis. But otherwise, I think that it's always very easy to look at edge cases and say, for example, people who are advertising homeopathy services, or who are trying to persuade people to use homeopathy. I would love to see those people banned from Facebook and Twitter, and they make a huge amount of money in India. And they also, many of them actually do suggest that people use homeopathy rather than going to a conventional doctor. So people do end up dying as a result. And homeopaths make me very angry. That kind of quackery makes me very angry. But I just, the problem is that if I were in charge of the entire world, everything would be perfect. I would decide on all of the cases, case by case. But I don't trust an algorithm to do that. I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg and his pals to do that. I'm also, I generally trust authorities, but I definitely see examples in which authorities have been wrong. So, 2 months ago, the official advice was we should not wear masks, that the main source of transmission for COVID-19 was through fomites, and therefore you're more likely to transmit it by putting your mask on wrong, quote unquote, or accidentally touching your mask and then touching something. And some people even, and when I say people, I mean some doctors and epidemiologists, even were posting this video of people breathing through masks, and they said the mask would get saturated with droplets, and then you would be actually spraying more COVID droplets out into the world with your mask on than without your mask on. All kinds of things, which never made sense to me, but there was a strong anti-mask thing. And then that shifted over into a pro-mask thing. And now, at least in the UK, masks seem to have been mostly forgotten. It's like you should only wear a mask when you're on public transport. So I feel as though if we had not allowed the people who are calling for masks to be worn to post about that because it was quote unquote misinformation, that would have been very damaging. One of the things we see with this virus is that we are naive about the virus. We just simply don't know that much about it, and so information is constantly being updated. And so it's hard to separate out. But I also have a couple of areas of skepticism of the received wisdom. And in those areas, of course, I feel like I know which the correct areas are to be skeptical of and which are not. But in those areas, I would really not like to see the quote unquote unorthodox view cited as misinformation. My two areas of skepticism are low fat diets, and also I do keto, and also I'm skeptical about the WHO is still promoting neonatal circumcision as a measure against HIV, and I think this is complete nonsense. If anybody's more interested in that, I did a very deep dive into that along with Brian David Earp, medical ethicist.
Yes.
So that is the official WHO position, and I think that official WHO position is wrong. So that makes me feel that we shouldn't gatekeep ideas, that we should just allow them to be out there, even though, as always with free speech, it has the worst negative trade-offs, I think, of any basic human right. Because people can use speech for all kinds of really terrible purposes. And people with bad ideas, as you said, Vincent said, can be silver-tongued and incredibly persuasive. So people's speech can do a huge amount of damage. They can make you buy their homeopathy, and they can make you want to kill Muslims in your country. They can make you watch the Star Wars prequels, all kinds of really appalling things. I should stop with that joke. It's getting old now.
No, it's great.
And so I understand why it's a really hard thing to fight for, because there are so many negatives to it, and I think those negatives are almost unavoidable. We have to just keep struggling against the disinformation, but I think that I don't favor censorship. No. That was an extremely long answer, a much longer answer than you were hoping for, I'm sure, but that's my answer.
But there's a great level of gradation to that, which is why we value free speech and intellectualism. Following along those lines, there's another project I believe you've been working on with some other people, like Letter.wiki.
Yes.
One of the major downsides to social media is it gives us a platform to participate in mob justice. It gives us the avenue to vent unparalleled outrage, public shaming, and any opinion or discussion can turn into a mob event that can make discussion, again, of details and nuance impossible. And I think one of the more revolutionary approaches to this, approach out of it, rather, is Letter.wiki. And to those in our audience who may not be familiar with it, it's a forum in which an online conversation between individuals can be exchanged at length. That's not limited to say, Twitter's old 140 character limit. And now I've seen some conversation on there that at times seemed to be a little barbed, but it largely seems to be a platform where people, thank goodness, are exchanging conversations in a very thoughtful fashion. It doesn't take long for any kind of discussion of anything controversial to bleed over into conflict. Now, and speaking for myself, I've failed many, many times in this regard because, shamefully, like, I let my own sense of self-righteous indignation just take over. And on social media, with the knowledge that the mob can comment, like, dislike, really doesn't help that kind of sentiment. And from that aspect, it's easy to see why conversation is difficult, but I think there's another facet at work here, and I think that facet is that humans just are not inherently rational. We don't value evidence, and we don't know how to argue. Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, they've come out with how to have difficult conversations, and there is a lot of literature out there to teach you how to have a conversation. But in the light of this, I'm very, very haunted by a question I believe Sam Harris once put out there. How do you teach someone to value evidence who does not value evidence?
I don't know. I think that Well, I think that there are a few things that happen on letter that nudge people in the direction of good conversations. It is, of course, possible to have an extremely horrible experience exchanging letters with somebody. I mean, that's what hate mail was originally, letters, of course.
Yeah.
Um, and we haven't as yet had to put in any kind of mechanism to sort of prevent people from being spammed with nasty letters. Um, we will if it's necessary. At the moment, we're not doing that. But I think that there are two things happening. One is just the length, just having more length and encouraging more length encourages more nuance, especially when you are speaking at length directly to another person. So, for example, when you're writing a Facebook status, I use Facebook. I write on Facebook only every few months, and I write an essay length, article length status. I think I have maxed out the Facebook word limit on several occasions. There is a word limit. It's like at 8,000 words or something, they cut you off. And so you certainly can do that, but you don't have a particular specific interlocutor in mind when you do that. And people will also write very, very long comments on Facebook, and that can be a problem, actually. People can get engaged in a kind of complete rant. But the problem, so more words leads to more, kind of tends to lead to more nuance. It's the opposite of the sloganeering problem we were talking about.
Right.
But on Facebook, you have the other problem, which is you're not quite sure who you're talking to. And that encourages you to simply virtue signal. Signaling is always easier, and humans will always go with it, or mostly go with the easier option. Whereas when you're writing a letter to somebody, you at least know exactly who you're talking to. And that tends to encourage you to try to persuade them, or try to see things from their point of view, or try to steelman their arguments, etc. And I've noticed a lot of the writers on letter, there's no prompting from us. You can write whatever you like on there. But I've noticed that a lot of people are doing this in their letters. They're saying, first of all, let me lay out what your point of view is, and we'll see whether you agree that I have represented your point of view fairly, which is just never happens on Facebook and
Right.
or Twitter, or almost never. And I think that so both Facebook and Twitter, you are talking in the midst of a crowd. There's a sense in which you are on letter too, because it is public. So a lot of letter writers, I can feel that they're very self-conscious. They're really, really aware that other people are reading the letter. But nevertheless, you're not sort of shouting your words out in the middle of a crowd. It doesn't have this gladiatorial feel. And that makes a lot of that specificity of address. I'm writing my letter to you, specifically, Bruce. That really makes a difference. That really seems to calm the waters a lot. And I think that, gosh, there was a second point I was going to make. This is what happens when you get old. Where has that amazing stroke of genius gone? It has disappeared. It has disappeared.
Still there.
Maybe I'll think of it when it will come back to me. Oh, yes, I think the other thing is that, generally speaking, people are hoping for a reply. And we have set the site up such that if you write a letter to somebody and they don't reply, sure, you can share your letter, but we're not going to make it prominent on the site. You can write an open letter if you don't have someone to write to. You can write an open letter, and if we think those are good, those we will share, and then people will write back, and then the correspondence begins. But if you write write a letter to somebody and they don't want to answer it for whatever reason, then it will be in their inbox, but you can't easily find it on Ledger without searching. You can find it, it's on there. And eventually we might just decide to allow people to even to hide letters, particularly abusive or bad letters, but we haven't decided. But at the moment it's on there, but it's nowhere prominent. It will only kind of be more prominently visible if and when the person answers. So there's an incentive for you to get an answer, and that is an incentive to be more, not necessarily polite, but just be more interesting. I think as Helen Pluckrose recently she said the marketplace of ideas is a marketplace. So you better have something to sell that people want to buy. Um, and there is a kind of sense of that. But I think also that the genre's overwhelming association with personal communication really helps too. So I'm noticing a large number of people specifically saying not only why they think something, but how they came to have that view. So they're saying, well, I'm a libertarian, but not just, this is why, in a sense, this is the opposite of your facts and logic thing. Because instead of saying, here's why I think libertarianism is good, here are the rational reasons that I'm laying out for you. I think libertarianism personally is terrible, by the way. But there are people out there, of course, who are convinced. They will say, well, I was going through this thing in my life and I encountered these problems, and then and this is why I've always been kind of inclined in this direction. So they're giving you a personal, a kind of epistemological memoir in a way, and it makes people much more relatable, and it just makes it much easier to approach than you saying, no, I'm more logical, and I'm saying, no, I'm more logical. Because no one will admit to being the irrational and illogical.
The Battle of the Vulcans.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to sort of stay on the topic of these social media sites. The power that these social media sites have is just nothing short of astounding, in my opinion. So we've witnessed what it could do to the political dialogue. Some analysis go so far as to say that Twitter, among Facebook, had a say in changing the direction of the 2016 American election. I think this is a big deal, and I don't think people are taking it as seriously as they should. So sites such as Twitter, which overall is only a small glimpse into what the general public actually believes. And there's studies out there that demonstrate that Twitter is not indicative of the general public's opinion. And yet they hold great power over what happens in this country. They control the political narrative to some extent. Do you think that this is a problem to Western democracies? We need to be much more precarious about this situation?
So I certainly think that one problem is the way in which the media often take Twitter as representative of public opinion. So, by the way, can you still hear my microphone okay?
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that is very, that is troubling, because they are using that to influence policy. The idea that this is the general opinion on things. And it's also extremely polarizing. So I see so many articles that are so-and-so faced terrible backlash for X and Y, and people are angry about Y and Z, and it's 4 tweets from some low follower accounts. I mean, literally, I think on one occasion it was like 3 tweets. And in total, they had 71 views between them. And it's like the public is outraged. So I think that it's very lazy, and I think that it's problematic that journalists have this disproportionate sense of how much trending hashtags and views expressed on Twitter are representative of the general public's views on things, because journalists have to be on Twitter and are therefore have this kind of Twitter derangement syndrome. I think that's a real TDS. It's the Twitter derangement syndrome. So there's that. I also bots are certainly a problem, and as are paid Twitter users. And this is a massive. I can't really speak to the American election situation. I don't know all the details of that, but this is a huge problem in India. Rohit Chopra has written a book about this called The Virtual Hindu Rashtra. So the Hindu nationalists, not just the BJP party, but the more extreme wings of the Hindu nationalists, like the paramilitary RSS, who are basically they're mostly armed with lathis, but some of them do have guns. The kind of an armed or semi-armed militaristic Hindu supremacist group. They are an absolute menace, and they have a very efficient at Twitter posting. So they recruit people and they pay them to basically post their stuff for them, and post things in their support. And these people are just on Twitter all day, opening multiple accounts and just spamming everybody with the most, disgusting stuff. Fake news about Muslims and kind of just endless hate mongering. And I used to come across quite a few of them. I think they've been a little bit in abeyance lately, but I have personally encountered quite a few of them on my Twitter account also. Whenever I tweeted about India, I always had a few of them in my mentions, and I would just block them right away because I don't want other people exposed to them. It's not even worth trying to argue with them. They're not there to have a discussion or be persuaded or anything else. They're just there to spread their message. And the disinformation thing, the misinformation and deliberate disinformation thing in India is huge. And the Indian government has been trying to tackle it by, for example, limiting the number of WhatsApp forwards you can send per day. So I think now you can only send 10 WhatsApp forwards per day. And as anybody who has lived in India or has Indian heritage like me will know, it's recorded in your, if you're Indian, it's recorded in your DNA that you're a member of at least 4 WhatsApp groups, whether you like it or not. You're just born a member of WhatsApp groups, and everybody forms a WhatsApp group, and everybody constantly forwards memes and information and videos, and many of them are doctored or mislabeled or completely false, and some of them are so toxic. And the famous example, I don't know if you saw this was a little while ago, so I'm sure there are far more recent examples, but it's just the example that sticks in my mind. It was a video which seemed to show 2 or 3 men, I think maybe 3 men. I'm a little hazy on the exact details, so don't quote me on this, but let's say 3 men on motorbikes riding up to a village and snatching children and riding off with them. And this was circulated on WhatsApp under the guise of watch out for these guys who are a white slave trade, an Hindu slave trade organization. And in many iterations of this, they were Muslim guys. Watch out for these dastardly Muslim guys who are coming to who are riding around the country on their motorbikes, kidnapping children. And 3 guys on motorbikes entered some small village in Uttar Pradesh, and they were lynched. They were killed by an angry crowd who thought that they were the people in the video, who thought they recognized them from the video. And it turns out the video was an excerpt from a Pakistani safety video about how to look after your children to prevent them from being abducted. And everyone in the video was an actor. And it had begun and ended with, with some clear speech explaining why this was, and with captions. But the speech at the beginning and end of the video and the captions had been shed somewhere along the line, and this video was circulating as if it were a crime, an actual crime that had happened. So that's a quite extreme example, but there's a lot of that kind of thing in India. And I personally received quite a few messages like that, which were either quack medicine things or else, kind of really hate-mongery stuff. So it's a huge problem. I guess I don't have an answer, but it's a huge problem. There should be a way of purging bots from the system. I think that would be important, but I don't know how that works algorithmically. And I think that it would be problematic to make everybody prove their identity, or prove their identity at least to the Twitter people, because of some of the actions Twitter and Facebook have taken in China and also in Muslim countries. In Pakistan, Facebook docks the members of a humanist society. So I think that it's important that we can still have anonymity, and I'm not sure how that is going to be really compatible with fact-checking. So I don't know. I don't have an answer.
We're investigating a lot of heavily complex subjects that as much as I would like to have a solution come up by the three of us today, I'm not sure we're going to get there, but hopefully we're helping with the conversation to some degree. I'd like to take a little spin on a subject that using one of our favorite shows as a fun way to explore this. One of the things that Vincent and I usually talk about is the idea of cultural relativism and morality, and I definitely want to have a lot of fun with this topic. The three of us are fans of science fiction. I think, Iona, you and I are both huge fans of Babylon 5.
Oh, gosh, yes. Yeah. Babylon 5 is my favorite.
Yeah. And all three of us are Star Trek fans, so all of us should be familiar with the Prime Directive. Now, for our fellow listeners who aren't fellow nerds, the Prime Directive pretty much is a policy by the heroes of Star Trek to never interfere with another culture, to avoid placing our judgments, our biases against the idea of whatever culture is out there. Now, I remember as a child thinking this is an incredibly noble concept that is quite possibly steeped against the imperialism of the past, of the Western past. But as I got older, I started seeing things in more nuances. I thought that view became more and more questionable. To get this conversation started off, like morality is, as I stated before, is something that Vince and I discuss pretty often. We've talked about this with Peter Boghossian and Michael Shermer on this subject. Now, I think from your Twitter discussions, you hold to the belief that morality is subjective. Am I correct?
No, I think it's absolute. Actually, I'm definitely not a moral relativist. So I think that there may be some gray areas there of things that are kind of less harmful in one culture than in another. But no, I'm an absolutist. So I get in a lot of trouble by my view that, for example, that we should criminalize circumcision. I get in tons of trouble for that because, of course, it is very meaningful to certain culture in certain religions in specific ways. But I think that if something causes harm to an individual, then it causes harm to that individual, and therefore it's only individuals who have rights, not groups. I mean, I think I understand that. I understand the Prime Directive is about the kind of caution principle, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That you may think you know what's best for another culture, and this is true even in our own culture. There are so many policies that are implemented with the best of intentions, and they are counterproductive and have unexpected effects down the line. So you need to be clear that you know what impact your intervention is going to have, and whether it's going to actually make things worse. But I understand that caution principle, but I mostly think that the Prime Directive is trash, I have to say. I think it's more honoured in the breach. And the example that always first springs to my mind is, I think this is from Next Generation. It's called Half a Life, and it is the episode stars my alter ego. People always tell me I remind them of Waxana Troy. It stars Waxana Troy, and she has fallen in love with an alien from a planet where everybody is expected to undergo involuntary, well, it's voluntary, they all seem to agree to it, or most of them agree to it, euthanasia at age 60. For the good of the rest of society, so you don't have the burden of looking after old people, and so you can husband resources better. They've decided that everybody has to die at age 60, and they just arrange, a nice funeral service for them, and a painless form of euthanasia. And she has fallen in love with this guy. He's 59, and she's also 59. I mean, they're both about to turn 60 in this episode. And she begs Picard to intervene. I think it's Picard. I think it's the Next Gen. And she begs Picard to intervene, and he won't, because of the Prime Directive. And I think he should have done. I think he should have given this guy exile on board the Enterprise, and he and Waxana should have lived happily ever after. And there are a lot of examples like that. I think the very first, one of my friends was recently reminded me that the very first example of the Prime Directive is a kind of proto-Prime Directive that's mentioned in Enterprise. And the first time that is put into action, an entire race of sentient beings goes extinct because they don't intervene to prevent a genocide because of the Prime Directive. So I'm not a fan, not a fan of the Prime Directive.
Yeah, and my views have definitely changed in that regard, and I apologize. I think I said subjective earlier. I actually meant to say objective. My apologies.
Okay.
Right. But yeah, and I'm very skeptical of this of it myself, especially since I've been a fan of the series since its genesis, since I first saw the Next Generation. And one example that really stands out in my mind is the first season has Picard just flaunt the Prime Directive when I think Wesley Crusher was sentenced for death for doing something as lame as tripping into. It's been a while since I've seen the episode. He crushed some piece of gardening in season 1, and the aliens there wanted to put him to death for it, and Picard just stepped in against the Prime Directive, which is a door slamming shut criticism on culture, slamming shut the idea that you have to absolutely respect another culture, and he just flaunted it right there, which leads credence to the idea that there's some objective quality to morality. Now, we asked this question of our guests who share this perspective. How do you square objective morality with David Hume's naturalistic fallacy, the idea that because something is, it doesn't immediately follow that we ought to behave accordingly? Because if we want to, like for example, rape is natural in nature, but it doesn't make it moral. It's something that we actively push back against. So how do we square morality with being objective if with this really, really pesky dilemma, the naturalistic fallacies in our way?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is why, returning to Star Trek, you need the three elements of humanity. You need Spock, but you also need Bones and Kirk. You need logic, and you need emotion, and you need courage, because otherwise your logic and emotion are not of very much use, because the instant you get pushed back, you're going to collapse into a blancmange.
Well, I firmly believe with the idea that morality is objective, although I'm not entirely on board because of these philosophical quibbles. But when we hold the idea that morality is objective, it puts us in something of a pickle because it immediately shines a bright light on cultural relativism, and it really forces us to compare value systems. For leftists, this seems to be just an incredibly uncomfortable thing to do because leftists in particular, not liberal, I do draw that distinction. Leftists seem to be the most ready just to shit on our own value systems and ways of life, just blame the state of the world entirely, and in my opinion, unfairly on the United States. Now, not all of that perspective is incorrect, but there's objectively a blind eye turned to the racism, homophobia, and misogyny in other cultures, which is fetishized, and there's a subjective masochism on only the crimes of the West, while ignoring its ideas, which are celebrated in various parts of the world. I have a cousin in Hong Kong right now involved in the protests against China. They sung the American national anthem as they fight for their own rights, their own and their own democracy.
I saw that. That was incredible.
Yes. But right now, it forces us to confront objective results and objective states of being, flourishing or suffering, between narratives that focus almost exclusively on white guilt on the left and the populist, and the populist nationalistic narratives, the xenophobia that's on the right. But that requires a mind geared for rational, critical thought, in which humans are absolutely awful at. And we see how strongly narrative drives people. And we see that now, especially with the coronavirus being handled in the world and with the murder of Floyd. I don't see a third narrative coming into play that can really tap into the minds of people which recognize the good and bad that came from the Enlightenment. Now, do you believe that humans are capable of the kind of reason we need to drive forward in the 21st century?
I think that we don't just need reason, we need kind of reason and compassion. Compassion has to be informed by reason, obviously, because otherwise you have this problem with unwanted and unexpected side effects, this kind of road to hell that's paved with good intentions thing. But both elements are equally important, and I am very much a Pinkerian optimist, so I do think that things have got better in general over the long haul. I mean, things can be there. There's a lot of noise in this graph, and things can locally get worse. Things can even be locally getting worse for quite a long time, and we can go into kind of also smaller local troughs. But I do think the general trajectory is upward in terms of human flourishing. And I think that's likely to continue. And if it doesn't, the limiting factor is probably, well, I guess it could either be some kind of cataclysmic, unforeseen event of the kind which I recently read The Precipice. I've forgotten what the author's name is. I listened to an audiobook, which is why I don't remember his name because I wasn't picking up a physical book. That's my excuse anyway, and I'm sticking to it. He runs through all the different scenarios that could happen in the precipice and their relative likelihood. So something could happen, some unforeseen, some pandemic, but with a disease that is truly has a very high percentage fatality. We could all be dying in agonies tomorrow from some new disease that we have no idea is out there yet. Or a meteorite could strike, or we could precipitate Third World War and complete nuclear annihilation. All those things could happen, but I think the greater likelihood is that we will make it through, and there will be greater and greater flourishing. So my hunch, but it's really just a hunch, I wouldn't dignify it with anything stronger than that. It's just like a hunch. My kind of hunch is we will make it through and we will find solutions to existential threats. And I think that in general, looking globally, things have got better. So although this is not the best year of this century so far, I still feel that this century is better for more people in more ways than other centuries have been in the past. And I wouldn't want to go backwards. If I had a kind of Rawlsian veil of ignorance and I had no idea who I would be, what position I would hold in society, I wouldn't go back to any society of the past. I would stay right here. So I think that I do have faith in that. I do also think that some very old, well-established traditions are just wrong. I don't usually say cultures because a culture has so many different elements to it. So, for example, I grew up in Pakistan, and Pakistani music is the best music. Cook Studio, the Pakistan Cook Studio, is just the best musical tradition in the world. I'm sorry, that is just objectively true in my opinion. And also, I love shalwar kameez, I love saris. Pakistani biryani is the best. There are many elements of the culture which are either neutral or objectively good, I would say, or that at least if you don't think they're good, they do no harm and they provide diversity in a way that is valuable in itself. I think diversity is in itself of value, as long as it's not including things that are actively harmful. But there are then other elements of the culture which are deeply harmful, like misogyny and homophobia and the fact that atheism is illegal. Those kinds of things are, there's no free speech. Those kinds of things are actively harmful, and I don't have a problem with condemning those aspects of the culture, and I don't really, I don't think that the fact that they are in that culture should change how we feel about them. It might change how we feel about individual human beings because we might be more forgiving of a Pakistani man who is more sexist in his attitudes, for example, because he grew up within that culture. But I'm kind of a radical non-believer in free will. I'm a believer, but in free will anyway. I think that it's all luck all the way down. The opinions you hold and the views. I don't think you can really help what you believe to be true or what you think. It's really hard to control that. I think we can all behave as though we have free will. We certainly should behave that way. But fundamentally, I think that I feel like ideas are like a kind of microorganisms floating around, and you're going to get some of them are going to get inside you, and hopefully those are the good ones as opposed to the bad ones.
I've argued. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Yeah. No. I'm finished, I think.
Well, I've argued previously and quite strongly that because of technology and because of the conduits it's giving us to communicate with each other, that like our world is just shrinking faster and faster by the minute. And I have the firm belief that in the 21st century, that as the world gets smaller and smaller, cultures and different ideas are going to smash right up against each other. And I don't think one of the reasons I'm a moral objectivist is that moral relativism, I think, is inherently dangerous because it can incorporate ideas that, as we said before, that are antithetical to human rights, to women's rights, to gay rights, to the well-being of various peoples of color. And in order for us to move forward as a people, we have to put moral relativism aside and be able to criticize the bad ideas in other cultures, in all cultures, which is very dangerous for us to do because cultures often implies certain kinds of ethnicity, and with almost the implication that someone could be racist for criticizing someone's culture, when a criticism of an idea can actually lead to greater well-being for people both in and outside of that culture, that becomes a very difficult maze to navigate. But it's just my sincere hope that people listen to the ideas that you put out there, and I'm very, very glad we had the opportunity to talk to you today, because these ideas, these nuances, this fine thought is something that I think we all need to consider as we move forward into the 21st century. Because I think I speak for all three of us here, that not being familiar with the actual science, I'm not sure if we'll ever actually reach out so far into the galaxy like in Star Trek. But I do hope for yeah, I agree, and I hope for a future in which we do have something like the Federation in Star Trek, because that is the optimistic future that Gene Roddenberry calls for. But sometimes it's hard to see that, but I hope that we can achieve that eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Iona, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have a conversation with you, and I sincerely hope that you come back. Where can people find you on social media?
So I'm on Twitter at Iona Italia. You can also, I do have a lot of people writing to me, so I'm please ask me before writing, but I am also at Ledger. You can find me if you just go to ledger.wiki and search for Iona Italia. You can, I have published 2 books last year in 2019, which you can find on Amazon. They're called Our Tangled World. It's a sort of psychological, sociological, and philosophical ruminations that begin with Argentine tango as a kind of a springboard. It's not a how-to dance book or anything like that, or a memoir. It's my navel fluff arranged around the subject of tango. And I'm also, you could also follow me on Instagram if you really want to. It's Iona Italia, and it's mostly pictures of flowers from our garden.
Oh my God, people, we definitely need those sorts of pictures in this year.
I can't let this podcast end without doing a final Babylon 5 plug. I think you said that your Star Trek character is Lwaxana Troi.
Yes.
Well, I have to say this. It's for the Babylon 5 fans, the good guys have an army called the Rangers, and I like to think that we're all involved in the battle for rational and ethical thought. So, assuming that we're the Rangers, we now have the Entel Za on this podcast. I have to end this podcast by saying Iona
Wow.
and
That
Entel
is
Za
so
Fini.
Oh my God. I think that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me.
All right. Well, thank you once more for coming on the podcast. It's been absolutely an honor to have you on, and we hope to see you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.